Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we have 4 creepypasta stories for your listening pleasure. I'm going to warn you, the 4th story is incredibly good, but also quite graphic. So for all of those of you who perhaps have a nervous disposition or a weak stomach, this probably isn't for you. But I'll leave that down to your discretion. I would also like to thank Wolf's Campfire for joining me in tonight's episode. You'll find a link to his channel in the description as well as the end. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. We don't talk about the ones who never come back. Not in my house, not at school, not anywhere in my town. But not talking about them doesn't bring them back, and it doesn't stop more people from disappearing. So I'm going to tell you everything I know. The first disappearance I remember is Julie Wilkins in the 3rd grade. She had blonde hair and pigtails, and always wore a bright red sweater even in the summer. I didn't think anything of it, until the first day she was gone. But I asked my teacher about her on the 2nd day. "Julie? She's sitting right over there in her usual spot," Mrs. Peterson replied. The girl sitting in Julie's spot wore the same bright red sweater, but she had black hair and a mean face, and didn't look anything like Julie. I tried to explain that to the teacher, but Mrs. Peterson wouldn't listen. I kept insisting louder and louder, growing red in the face and screaming when the teacher wouldn't listen. I ran over to the imposter and pulled her hair, demanding with all single-minded fury of a 9-year-old girl to know what happened to Julie's pigtails. She cried and started pulling my hair back, and soon both of us were sent home early. I watched the mean-faced girl get picked up by Mrs. Wilkins, Julie's mum. The woman hugged the little girl and helped her into the back seat, and they drove away together. And every day after that, the girl with the black hair would sit in Julie's chair and chat with Julie's friends, until about after a month, I finally let it go and started calling her Julie too. Kate Bennett in the 6th grade, Steve Asaki in the 8th, Lisa Wellington junior year. There was never a fuss about it, so there was probably more that I didn't notice. I actually liked the new Lisa considerably more than the old one who used to stick gum everywhere, but that didn't make it okay. Because every time it happened, I couldn't stop thinking about, what if I were next? I didn't like the idea of someone else sleeping in my bed or hugging my mother. I liked the idea of what might have happened to the original person even less. As I got older, I started thinking there was something wrong with me. If their closest friends and family didn't notice the change, then maybe there was no change at all. Maybe I misremembered or hallucinated. Maybe there was something wrong with my eyes or my brain. Some unseen tumor, quietly swelling until the day I won't know anyone, and no one will know me. I still lived in the same small town during college though, and I didn't forget the lesson I learned in the 3rd grade. I kept my mouth shut and pretended not to notice. But it was a lot harder to pretend when I woke up one morning to find a stranger sleeping next to me where my fiancé used to be. I didn't wake him, I just watched him sleep, trying to imagine what would become of us. The new Robert wasn't unhandsome. He was in better shape than my fiancé had been. If the other replacements were any indication, then he'd still know who I was and what I meant to him. I tried to go along with it, but couldn't even make it through the first morning. I flinched when he kissed me, and just watching him get dressed in Robert's clothes was enough to make me miss my real fiancé. I lay in bed pretending I was sick until he left for work. Then I jumped up and started packing my things. I was gone before he got back. No message, no letter, no explanation. Why should I try and mend a stranger's broken heart when I had no one to mend mine? They knew Robert didn't let me go that easily. I blocked his number, but messaging kept sliding through. Social media, email. He even renamed our shared Netflix account to say he missed me. I finally confronted him when he found out which friend I was staying with and knocked on the door. It's not you, it's me. Weeks of suffering from an invisible wound, and that was the best I could come up with. I tried to convince him that I was sick and needed to be alone, and he tried to convince me that he would help me get better. I'd almost gotten rid of him when my stupid friend started crying and thanking the stranger for not giving up on me. I guess that's when I gave up on myself. I let that man take me back to the place that I used to call home. I stood stiff as a board when he hugged me, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end when he stroked my head and told me that we would get through this together. Then I lay beside him in the bed we shared and wondered how the warmth of his body felt so much colder than love. I didn't sleep that night. I guess that's why I was the only one to hear the knock at the door after midnight. A burst of tentative taps, almost like someone wanted to be heard and was afraid to be noticed at the same time. I thought about waking the stranger in my bed, but I decided it was safer if he was asleep. I lay in bed for several long seconds before I heard the knocking again. It was faster this time, more urgent, and I slipped out of bed and crept downstairs, not turning on any lights, checking that the door was still locked. Then, up to the peephole. "It's cold out there and I can't find my key," Robert said through the door. I stared at my real fiancé through the peephole. "Are you in there? Hello?" The rapid knocking once more. How could I open the door? How could I invite him into our home with another man upstairs in the bed? But how could I not, and risk losing him again? I stood frozen at the peephole, watching him huddling under his jacket for warmth. "Let me in," this time he said. The other Robert would be awake soon, if he hadn't already. "Let me in, let me in." Suddenly he leapt at the door, started hammering on it with his fist. I jumped away from the shuddering wood in surprise, tripping over myself and collapsing on my arse. The original Robert felt instantly quiet, no doubt hearing me. "I know you're there. Don't do this to me. Let me in." And the hammering returned, stronger than ever. The whole door was trembling in its frame. The first light turned on upstairs, and shortly later, the crack of wood from the steps. I unlocked the door and flung it open. I clenched my eyes and braced for impact, expecting the real Robert to come flying into the room from his momentum. "Honey, what's going on downstairs?" the stranger's voice said. "I don't know. I thought I heard something." My voice ringing hollow in my ears as I stared at the empty darkness. I took a step out and welcomed the freezing air enveloping my skin. "You're already sick. Don't make it worse." I took another step in defiance. "I'm not sick," I told him, my voice more level than it had ever been. "I just don't love you. That's all." His snarl lasted less than a second, but it was enough so that I couldn't see his face without remembering it. "Don't you dare follow him," the stranger said. "Follow who?" I asked innocently, taking another step into the freezing night. The snarl returned, and this time it took several seconds to fade. He half turned away from me, then apparently changed his mind and lunged through the door after me. I was already running as fast as I could, the icy cold concrete driveway stinging my feet as some of the skin was left behind with every step. "Don't go out there. You'll disappear too." I wouldn't have minded disappearing though. I could disappear with Robert. The other ones can have the house. They can get dressed in our clothes and laugh with our friends and eat Christmas dinner with my family, but they won't have us. So I kept running, calling for Robert and hoping that he'd find me before my lungs froze stiff. Before the stranger caught me and dragged me back and fussed over me until I believed that I was sick too. I ran as long and as hard as I could, screaming until my throat was raw. But I didn't find Robert. The stranger had given up hours ago, but I kept going until morning when my fingers and toes were black and blue, and my blood felt like ice in my veins. and by the first touch of light, I found myself back at the house that had been my home, back to wondering whether I was really sick, and whether it would be the death of me. Only it wasn't my home anymore. This stranger who had replaced Robert was kissing his new fiancée who had replaced me, and there was a neighbor greeting them good morning, as though he'd known them both for years. And life goes on for the rest of the world who doesn't talk about the ones who never come back. As for me, without friends, a family, or a home to call my own, I finally know where the ones who disappear go. They can go anywhere, because there's nothing left to hold them back.
Ever since I was a kid, I've loved Disneyland. In 2001, when I turned 10, my parents took me to Disneyland for my birthday, and I instantly fell in love with the place. The costumed Disney characters were amongst my favorite next to all the awesome rides, the Matterhorn being my personal favorite. I remember giving Mickey Mouse a bear hug the moment I laid eyes on him, and my parents took several photos of me with the Disney princesses. Despite being a boy, I loved the Disney princesses, especially Ariel. Her beautiful voice always touched my very heart whenever I heard her sing. I also loved something else in my youth, and that was video games, specifically Disney games. Throughout my childhood, I loved playing Disney games such as Mickey's Speedway USA, Donald Duck Going Quackers, Kingdom Hearts, and several others as well. When Connect Disneyland Adventures was released in 2011 for the Xbox 360, I was about 16 years old and in high school. The moment I learned about this game, I was head over heels to get my hands on it, but my mom told me to wait until Christmas to get it. And once Christmas rolled around, I received the game as a stocking gift from my Aunt Kara, and I immediately became an instant fan of this game the moment I started playing it. The mini-games were amazing, the characters were incredibly lifelike and amazing, and everything about it just made me feel as if I were a kid again. I literally felt as if I were in the actual Disneyland park, though there were a few attractions missing from the game's version of Disneyland. These included Star Tours, Indiana Jones Adventures, Roger Rabbit's Cartoon Spin, and Tarzan's Treehouse. Apparently, from what I learned, those attractions were included in the game due to copyright issues. Despite this, I enjoyed the game more than any other Disney game I had played in the past, and so did my friends and family. My sister Tina was an ace at the Space Mountain minigame, and my mom loved the Big Thunder Mountain minigame. My favorite one was of course the Matterhorn, and it's a small world minigame since those rides were my favorite ones in the park. Within a few months, I had obtained all the hidden Mickeys, gotten all 44 snapshots, discovered all the areas of interest, and found all 79 photo passes in the game. By this point, I had pretty much completed every task in the game, but I was still hooked to it, like a moth to a flame. Unfortunately, it wasn't to last. About 8 years later, something would happen that would forever change my perspective of Disneyland, as well as reminded me that the world isn't as peaceful as one might think. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself though, so I'll get down to explaining. It was around February of 2019 when the story occurred. I was 24 years old and Kingdom Hearts 3 had just recently been released for the PS4 and Xbox One. So, as you can guess, I was very excited to try and get my hands on it. Unfortunately, the GameStop I usually went to for all my games was sold out of copies when I went there to check for one. So, I decided to head back home and order one on Amazon Prime. After I had returned home and purchased my copy of Kingdom Hearts 3 for Xbox 360 on Amazon Prime, I decided to entertain myself to a little bit of Smash Bros. Ultimate, since I had the day off from my forklifting job at Lowe's. I searched my game shelf for the Smash Bros. Ultimate when I came across a familiar game. It was none other than the Connect Disneyland Adventures. I had stopped playing it on a consistent basis a few years ago when I was 20 years old due to losing interest, but I still occasionally played when I got the chance. Deciding that I needed a bit of nostalgia, I took the game and inserted it into my old Xbox 360, eager to interact with my favorite Disney characters again, and have some fun adventures on the Matterhorn and It's a Small World. Once the system booted, I prepared to launch the game and stopped when a notification popped up. Curious, I checked it and it said a special update was available for the game, which kinda confused me. I didn't remember any updates being announced for this game, but then something came to me that got me thinking. At the time this game was released, Disney had not yet acquired the rights to Star Wars franchise, so Star Tours wasn't included in the game. Maybe the game was being updated with the Star Tours attraction, since the Star Wars franchise was now owned by Disney. If that was the case, I'd be so surprised and ecstatic. Star Tours was one of my favorite attractions at Disneyland, next to the Matterhorn, and It's a Small World. So I selected the update and the console began whirring. One thing I failed to notice though, was that this update had no description of what exactly it was, which got me a bit worried that this update might be a virus or spyware. I thought about maybe canceling the update, but my curiosity got the better of me, and I wanted to see what it was. Yet I made a personal note to quickly unplug the system if this unknown update turned out to be a virus or some sort of malicious software that could potentially harm my Xbox. However, once the update reached 71%, an error message appeared saying that the system had encountered an error and would need to restart. Frustrated, I tapped the reset button on my console and waited for the game to reload. It took some time, but eventually reached 100% without any problems, so I loaded up the game, expecting to maybe see some new attractions and minigames. However, what I saw next would make me look at Connect Disneyland Adventures and Disneyland itself in a completely different way. When the game opened up, I was greeted with a horrifying sight that has burned itself into my mind forever. My female avatar character stood in the very center of Fantasyland, or rather, what was left of it. All around my avatar, various attractions lay in ruins and some were on fire, including the large Cinderella castle. The castle looked as if a small plane had crashed into it. Most of it was in pieces and on fire, except for Aora's tower in the middle, and the drawbridge was cracked and bent in an odd angle, but still accessible. The sky was now a reddish brush fire color with light brown clouds, and smoke could be seen coming from all over different parts of the park. Also, there were no NPCs anywhere in sight. The Disney characters weren't present either. I also recognized the background music to the Keyblade Graveyard theme from Kingdom Hearts, Birth by Sleep, a tune filled with melancholy and sorrow, which seemed perfectly fitting given the situation. Another very unsettling thing I noticed was my avatar character. Her clothing was covered in dust and dirt, and her hair was all messy. She also had what appeared to be small cuts and bruises on her arms and legs, and there were a few years in her shorts and Disney t-shirt. The poor girl literally looked as if she had just escaped from a burning building or a war zone, and her reactions were completely different than usual. If I left my avatar standing in one place without touching the controller for about 4 seconds, she would clutch her arms towards her chest, and her legs would tremble in fright. She'd also look to the left and right with a frightened expression on her face, and even while moving around her, her expression didn't change. She'd still keep that frightened look on her face even while walking or running. I was completely disgusted by what I was seeing, and also a bit upset as well. Just what kind of sick, messed up joke was this? Was this part of the update? If so, just what the hell was going on here? Why did Disneyland now look like the aftermath of Hiroshima? I figured that the only way to find the answer to that question was to play the game and look for some clues to find the answers I sought. I decided to check Frontierland first for possible NPCs, or Disney characters since there obviously weren't any in Fantasyland. As I headed to my destination, my mind began racing with so many other questions that I desperately wanted answers to. Why was the park like this? What could have happened that ended up laying it to burning ruins? I had a few theories about what was going on and why things were as they were now, but I had no way of confirming them. One possible theory I had was that one of the Disney villains had been behind this supposed attack on Disneyland, and my goal was to defeat them. Another was some sort of natural disaster that had occurred, which left the entire park in ruins and killed everyone off, leaving my avatar as the lone survivor. The first theory seemed a bit more accurate than the second one, but like I said, it was only a wild guess. I had no way of knowing what was going on as of now, but I had a feeling that I would find out later on. As I made it to what was once Frontierland, I saw something near the entrance to Big Thunder Mountain, which was now mostly a pile of rubble. It was a large sign with a message on it. Curious, I walked up to it and read the following text, which read, "Happiness means nothing if everyone doesn't get along." I raised an eyebrow in complete confusion. What the hell? I thought, confused. What was that message supposed to mean? Happiness means nothing if everyone doesn't get along. What was this implying? It didn't make an inch of sense as to what was going on here. I read the message again about 5 times, trying to figure out what it meant, but I couldn't. I wondered if maybe the message had something to do with the park looking like a war zone, but I just wasn't sure. It didn't provide enough details for me to give the answers I wanted, so I moved on, hoping there'd be other clues around the ruined park to solve this very unsettling mystery. I headed out of the area, moving past burning kiosks and toppled waste bins, still finding no NPCs or Disney characters anywhere in sight. I also didn't see Karen, the park guide, anywhere either, though I wasn't too surprised. Everywhere I went, I only saw more and more destruction all around me, but still no other NPCs. Riders and attractions were in ruins, and some of them had flames dancing around them. It was a very morbid scene, and I couldn't understand what the point of all this was. Why would Disney put such a dark-themed update like this in a game meant to be family-friendly? Was Disney even the one who made the update? I had no way of knowing, at least not yet. I eventually came to the Matterhorn, which was now in complete ruins. The bobsleds were knocked over. One of them had been melted by flames surrounding the now burning mountain, and the water was also almost completely dried up. I also saw another sign near one of the toppled bobsleds and ran towards it to see what the message was. The message on the sign, "This place is a facade to escape reality." Again, I was left confused and bewildered. I didn't know what to make of this message. The place was a facade. What the heck was that supposed to mean? Was the message referring to the Matterhorn? Or the park itself? These messages didn't give me a clear enough explanation as to what was going on, so I ended up being left with more questions than answers. Not finding anything useful, I left the Matterhorn behind, and decided to try another attraction in hopes of finding the answers I needed. The closest one was It's a Small World, so I headed straight for it, hoping to find some answers. But at the same time, I was worried about what I'd find there. Once I reached the attraction, I was horrified at what lay before me. The large Small World castle was on fire, and parts of it were in pieces. The large clock face had fallen off the burning castle and lay burning on the ground. Once I reached the attraction, I was horrified at what lay before me. The large Small World castle was on fire, and parts of it were in pieces. The large clock face had fallen off the burning castle and lay burning on the ground. And several of the boats were on fire as well. I couldn't believe what I was seeing and teared up. I know it might sound strange to cry about something like this, but It's a Small World was one of my most favorite attractions in the park, and seeing it in burning ruins like this nearly broke my heart. But what broke my heart even more was the message written on a sign next to the attraction entrance that said, "There is no happiest place on earth. Not when hatred and violence still exists with the hearts of many." After reading that unpleasant message, I decided to press on and see if any of the other attractions had similar responses. As I was about to head over to Mickey's Toontown, I stopped when I noticed something. Or rather, someone. near the exit of It's a Small World. It was a little Asian girl with black hair tied up in 2 black buns, wearing a dark purple skirt and a light purple t-shirt with a violet collar, socks of the same color, and black shoes. I quickly recognized her as a character named Ling from It's a Small World TV series and wondered why she was in the game. The characters from that series didn't normally appear in this game, but I suspected that the update had something to do with it. Ling was sitting on the ground, looking downwards at it, and when I approached her to try and speak to her, she looked up at me with a saddened look on her face and said, "Not satisfied." I tried speaking to her again, and this time she actually responded. Ling said, "If it's answers you seek, go to the top of Cinderella's castle." She then resumed her sad posture, and I turned around to leave, thankfully for finally finding some useful information. At the same time though, I felt very uneasy and nervous about what I'd find in that castle, even more so than when I had been heading for It's a Small World. I had already been thinking a lot about the other 3 messages I had seen back at Big Thunder Mountain, Matterhorn, and It's a Small World, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was all some sick prank being pulled by Disney, or if someone else not associated with Disney was behind this horrid update. I was pretty convinced at this point that Disney wasn't behind this. They'd never put something like this in a family-friendly game, like Connect Disneyland Adventures, so that meant someone else had to have done it. I also wondered if other gamers who owned this game got the same horrid update as I did. If so, why hadn't Disney noticed it? Surely someone would have reported it by now. I had only been playing the game for about 40 minutes, but it felt like an hour to me. It took me a few minutes to make it back to the Cinderella Castle, and when I reached it, I crossed the broken bridge and entered the castle corridor when I saw a door labeled Tower Entrance. I then entered the door and started climbing a long spiral staircase that seemed to stretch on for hours. As I climbed the steps, I began to notice various posters pasted on the walls, and what I saw on those posters made me almost gasp in shock. The images on those posters depicted some very disturbing and graphic things that I can tell you should never be put in a family-friendly game like this one. One of the first posters I saw depicted the Holocaust of World War II. It showed the Nazis committing various atrocities against the Jews of Europe, and the death camps, the enormous pile of corpses, the gas chambers, and so much more. However, it got so much worse as I pressed on. The next poster I saw showed images of the atrocities committed against the Chinese by the Imperial Japanese Empire, such as the Nanking Massacre, women being beheaded with swords, and children being shot and beaten by animalistically savage Japanese soldiers. I also saw images of the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan, then the aftermath, which depicted a bunch of Japanese people, ranging from adults to children, all suffering from severe radiation burns and radiation poisoning. The last poster I passed showed the 9/11 bombing attacks on the Twin Towers, and the Pentagon in highly graphic detail, such as the planes flying into the towers and exploding, and also of people jumping out of the burning towers and falling to their deaths. I was sickened by what I saw on those horrible posters, and I knew for a full-on fact that my earlier guess was right. Disney wasn't behind this. Whoever had made this update was probably a hacker, or perhaps some very sick-minded Disney employee trying to scare or sicken other gamers. But what the biggest question I had was why anyone would do this. What was the point of taking such a wonderful and amazing game like this and then warping and twisting it into some sick, perverted nightmare like this? And why those messages and horrid posters on the walls? I kept replaying those messages in my mind along with what Ling told me back at the remains of the Small World Castle, and began to wonder what all of them were implying. But as I looked at more and more of the highly disturbing posters as I climbed the tower, a horrible thought came to me as I gazed at the posters. I thought back to the messages and then looked at the posters again. I began to piece some things together in my head. I had already a good idea of what was going on, but this pretty much covered it. I thought back to the third message that stated that there was no happiest place on earth as long as violence and hatred still existed in people's hearts. Then I began to realize what was happening. Once I finally reached the tower, I expected to see either Princess Cinderella or Aora there, but I was instead greeted by a character that never appeared in the game before. It was Yensid, the wizard from the first Fantasia film and Kingdom Hearts 2, standing at the tower balcony and gazing down at the burning inferno that was once Disneyland. When I walked up to him and spoke to him, he kept his back turned on me, but still spoke back to me. "So you've come. I take it Ling must have told you this tower holds the answers you seek. Did she not?" Yensid asked in a concerned tone. He then turned around to face me, and I noticed that he had a serious expression in his face. "Do you not understand that you can't run from the one truth that you all attempt to escape by coming here? It doesn't matter where you go, or what you try to deny. There is no happiest place on earth, not even here," Yensid explained sternly. "This park is merely an escape that you people use to escape the true evils that lurk in the outside, and that evil is yourselves. You fight wars amongst yourselves, create weapons of mass destruction, and commit countless atrocities. As long as these horrible traits still exist within you humans, there will never be true happiness or peace on Earth, not even in this place." I felt my heart drop as I took everything in Yensid had just said. Those messages back at the burning attractions, the posters on the tower stairway walls, it all made sense now. They were all conveying one big message, and I knew what it was now. The message that the creator of this sick update seemed to be conveying was that no place on Earth was peaceful as long as everyone still fought amongst themselves and refused to put aside their differences. However, Yensid didn't explain why the park was in flaming ruins, but I soon got my answer to that question. Yensid then said in an angry tone, "Can you not see what has become of this place because of your acts of violence? Your wars have brought destruction upon this place. If you believe me not, then observe." Yensid then held out his hand, and a large orb of light appeared within them, forming a moving image. The image showed the park the way it was before the horrid update, and all the NPCs and Disney characters could be seen enjoying themselves and entertaining each other. But then, there was trouble. The image zoomed into two objects in the sky heading straight for the park, and they caught the attentions of both the NPCs and the Disney characters. As the objects got closer, I realized in horror what they were. They were ballistic missiles. At that moment, I knew what was about to happen and began to tense up. And what I saw happen next still gives me nightmares to this day. Both missiles struck the park head-on, hitting both Tomorrowland and Frontierland, which sent two massive explosions across the park that incinerated everything in its path. All the NPCs and Disney characters began running and screaming in both terror and agony, as they too were incinerated to ashes by the explosive shockwaves. What made this sight even more disturbing and horrifying was the fact that their deaths were shown in highly graphic detail. A child NPC was shown burning slowly to death on the ground, with her flesh burned completely off her body, revealing some of her bones and charred organs, and several others were shown laying on the ground, dead, with charred skeletons being the only parts left of their corpses. It was the most sickening thing I'd seen this far since the update, and I felt the urge to puke at this gruesome sight. Within a few minutes, the park was now in complete ruins, and all the characters were nothing more than piles of ashes. The orb then vanished, and Yensid glared directly at the screen with rage in his eyes. "Now you understand? This is proof that there is no happiest place on Earth, not even in this park. You come here to try and escape the harshness of the outside world by entertaining yourself like children, but in reality, you are only running away from your conflicts like cowards. You basically create delusions and you attempt to escape the outside world using those delusions, but in the end, you will always fail. He boomed. Yensid then cast a fire spell, which hit the screen and caused static to erupt. Then an error message appeared saying the game had encountered a problem and would need to restart. Instead of restarting it though, I just shut the system off along with the TV and sat back on the couch, staring ahead while completely lost in the thought by everything I had just seen. My entire childhood had just been ruined, all thanks to some sick-minded programmer who probably hacked into Disney to upload this disgusting update into the game. Despite knowing that it was only a game, I couldn't help but think about everything Yensid had said and what those messages said. As much as I wanted to deny all of it, I knew deep down that the messages I saw in that game were legit. And so were Yensid's words. Everyone, including me, would always see Disneyland as the happiest place on Earth, when in reality, we're only lying to ourselves. As Yensid said so himself, there is no happiest place on Earth. Theme parks like Disneyland, Disney World, Knott's Berry Farm, and every other theme park around the world are just facades we use to escape the harsh reality of the outside world. And once we leave, our problems will be out there, waiting for us, what they may be. I believe that was the message the hacker was trying to send to the player, but for what reason, I don't know. I had no idea who this person was, or what their intentions were. However, I found that out a few hours later when I turned on the news and found out something shocking. A retired 30-year-old military veteran by the name of Sammy Burns had been arrested for being involved in a serious act of illegally hacking into Disney's gaming servers. He had served in the Marine Corps for about 5 years in Iraq and was discharged at age 28 due to PTSD. Apparently, he was also very skilled with computer programming and had been the one responsible for creating the update and Connect Disneyland Adventures. Sammy had used the deep web to hack into various gaming systems all over the US, where he sent a homemade DLC version of the game to thousands and thousands of other players who owned it, and I was one of them. Once other players received the update, they began immediately flooding Disney with calls about the content on the game. Yet, the higher-ups at Disney and the creator of Connect Disneyland Adventures had no knowledge of this so-called update. But when several other players started sending screenshots of the game to Disney and explaining what they found in the game as well, they immediately got several law enforcement agencies involved to try and track down the source of this obvious hack. A few undercover agents using the deep web eventually tracked Mr. Burns by tracing his IP address and arrested him for illegal activity online. Due to not disabling JavaScript, law enforcement easily tracked him down. Sammy claimed to the police that the people had lost their way by not seeing the true horrors of the world, so he tried to convey a message to everyone in a way they'd all notice, and that was by hacking a video game and using it to spread his word to everyone that the world isn't a happy place as some would think it is. Sammy also said to the police, while in tears, that he was forced to shoot several armed children in Iraq who had been members of a terrorist group attacking his team, then claimed to hear their screams in his nightmares. He was later confined to a mental hospital for his PTSD symptoms and mild insanity, and that's all I know. I don't know why Sammy would ever do what he did, but I can only guess that whatever he had witnessed over in Iraq must have really messed him up. War can really drive even the most sane person to insanity and cause them to become something far worse than just trained killers. And I believe that's what happened to Sammy. I don't believe that he was an evil man, but rather someone who had simply tried to express his feelings and personal opinions, yet chose the wrong method to do so. It's been 2 years since the whole incident took place, and I can never look at that game or Disneyland the same way ever again after what I saw in that hacked update. Whenever I go there with my family, I am reminded of everything that the game had told me, and that our world has no happiest place anywhere. There is no happy place in a world where humanity constantly fights among themselves for power, greed, and so many other things. Humans are a violent race, and unless we put aside our differences and change our ways, the world will never truly be a happy place.
I bought a bag of runestones at an estate sale. They were quartz crystal. They had some clarity to them, but were mostly opaque. They were still beautiful. I didn't know how to use them, so I just held them and admired their beauty. Sometimes when I held them, they would grow warm and stay warm for hours. But I just assumed it was my body heat. I still think it was to some extent. I had such good luck for the next 6 to 8 months that I had them. I found money laying on the sidewalk several times. I got a 10% pay rise from my bosses, and things were so peaceful in my home. I received an unexpected refund check that paid my bills for several months. Just lots of little special things. Nothing like winning a big lottery. I was just lucky. Then one day, my husband was hurt in an accident at work. Now we know he has a permanent back disability. But at the time, we all knew that he was in pain. And the doctors were scrambling to fix the neurological damage done to his spine so that he wouldn't be paralyzed. He couldn't move his legs for several weeks, but he is walking today, if in pain. So I guess in the end, it is lucky. But one day, while he was suffering through those last few weeks, I was home scrambling to clean the house, feed our teens and get back to his side at the hospital, when I suddenly was overwhelmed with grief, and I sat on the edge of the bed to cry. It's then that I remembered the stones. I glanced to my bookshelf where I had laid the red velvet bag that contained them, and they were gone. No explanation. The kids, of course, had no clue. Nowhere to be found. I later asked my husband, but he remembered nothing about them. Time passed, and we were consumed by life. His recovery, his rehab, then the work disability, and finally job loss. It was months before I thought of them again. We lost our house as I was packing to put things up in storage, and I thought again about the runestones, and I realized that our luck had gone south about the same time of their disappearance. It may have all been coincidental, buying the stones and having good fortune, but the subsequent loss of them at the beginning of all the bad luck. I really didn't believe in magic, not really. But if acquiring such an item brings short-term good luck, then we paid threefold in pain and suffering for what we lost. I'm not going to be trying any more occult objects anytime soon. It's just not worth the risk. I'm not sure where or how to begin, so I'll just give a bit of context about myself before telling my story. My name's Todd Summers, and I'm a 29-year-old male living in a small apartment complex in the state of Oregon. My life, or what I can only describe to be a miserable existence, isn't pleasant or peaceful. It hasn't been since the day of my 18th birthday, in the year of 2008, the year that I lost everything, and on what was supposed to be the most special day of my life. Why my life's miserable, you might be asking? Well, it's a very long and pitiful story. It's not a story I've shared with many people, due to how traumatized I get just even remembering the events of that one year. But I feel as though I need to tell someone about it before I completely lose what sanity I have left and go completely bananas. When I was a kid, roughly between age 4 to 15, I lived in New Mexico with my mum, my 5-year-old sister Shannon, and my dirtbag father, in a 1-story house in a quiet neighborhood. My mum worked as a cashier at a CVS at the time, and my dad worked as a professional landscaper. My mum was very kind towards me and Shannon while we were growing up, but my dad was a totally different story. I'll explain a bit about him first. My dad always seemed like a casual guy in public, but in reality, he was possibly the worst type of scumbag that you could ever come across. He was an alcoholic and a complete abusive sack of horseshit when not on the job or in public. In addition to that, he also had the temper of an enraged gorilla. Ever since I can remember, he'd abuse us in the most horrible ways you can imagine. He'd beat us with a razor-wired riding crop whenever we got on his nerves or did something he didn't like, locked us up in the basement, deprived us of food, and did some other things that were so horrid that I don't even want to mention it. I have many scars because of this. My mum was also a victim to his abuse and would constantly be berated, slapped, assaulted, and beaten by Dad if she tried to stand up to him or defend us. Because of the constant abuse my dad put her through, she easily gave in to his will and did not try standing up for herself. And I couldn't blame her for that. My sister Shannon was like my mother, a kind-hearted girl who would always try to stand up for me when I was in trouble. But she was also timid like my mum was, since she also suffered heavy abuse from our father and was too afraid to try and stand up to him. Now that I've mentioned a bit about my family, I should mention everything that happened a year prior to my 18th birthday, before I continue the story, so you get a better understanding of things. My dad never allowed Mum to let me or Shannon have birthdays in his house, as he put it, because he always said that we were mistakes that God put on the planet, and that mistakes don't need it or deserve birthdays. Because of this, none of us were able to have a real birthday, since he was usually home on all my previous birthdays and would make sure that Mum didn't try throwing any parties behind his back. If she argued about it with him, or so much as even mentioned our birthdays around him, Dad would beat her with his razor-wired riding crop until she bled in some areas. She had a lot of scars on her body because of his previous beatings, and so did Shannon and I. About 2 years prior to my 18th birthday, my dad had gotten fired from his construction job for reasons I didn't know. Now, this may sound very hard to believe when I tell you this, but I assure you that it's true. My mum never found out that my dad was fired because of 2 things. 1, he never told her, and 2, he lied to my mum and said that he'd been promoted and would be starting at his new job location as the assistant manager, but it would be a few months or so before he started. How do I know he was fired? Because the year he was fired, I heard him from my living room having a shouting match over the phone with supposedly his boss about how he never liked the job anyway, and that his boss's whole company was just a giant pile of dog shit that deserved to be burned from the ground. I remember feeling my blood turn to ice when I overheard him threatening his boss by saying that if he even so much as thought about telling the police about what he found, he'd have his new friend, some guy by the name of Mr. Victor Vasquez, silence him and his family. I don't know who this Vasquez guy was, and honestly, I wasn't sure that I wanted to find out. By some stroke of bad luck, my dad had noticed me overhearing his argument and warned me that if I spoke a word of this to my mum, he'd chain me and Shannon up in the basement and beat us with a crowbar until our skulls bled out. Terrified, I never said a word to my mum about it, although I probably should have. My mum's job luckily provided her enough money to keep the house running, but the next several weeks were after that phone call. Things didn't get any better. I honestly don't know why she didn't divorce my dad, after all the shit he put her through all those years. I even questioned Mum as to why we couldn't do just that many times before, but she said that it was because his job made more money than hers did, and she wouldn't be able to keep affording the house if she filed for divorce. Once Dad started going to work at this news site, 4 months later, my mum began to grow suspicious when she noticed a few things. The first thing she noticed was that my dad started hanging out with these mean-looking Mexican guys, who he said were part of his new construction crew, over to our house to chat and get drunk on our front yard. But my mum had doubts about that being true. These men were about as cruel and heartless as my dad, if not worse. My mum got very bad vibes from these men, due to the way they acted. They would make very rude and offensive comments about my mum, Shannon, and I. Some of the comments were even racist. If my mum told them to stop or tried to get them to leave, they'd get hostile and threaten to tie her up and beat her if she didn't show them respect. My dad actually shared that opinion and told my mum that unless she wanted to be sodomized by his friends, she better show some respect towards them. He'd say things like, "You better do as my boys say and show them some respect, unless you want to get hurt. They're my friends, and no one shows any disrespect towards them." Also, that one thing she noticed was how much money he had started making. Each Friday, Dad would receive paychecks of up to about $50,000 to $60,000, which was far higher than the amount of money he used to get paid on his previous work location. My dad's job paid him about $25 an hour, so there's no way that he would be making that much money in just 2 weeks. When my mum questioned him about why his pay rate was so incredibly high, all of a sudden Friday night, when me and Shannon were eating dinner in the living room, he lied and said it was because he was working for a very wealthy contractor who paid him extra for overtime. She didn't believe him and demanded to know where he was working and what this new job involved. And my dad got aggressive and told her that it was none of her business. My mum said, "None of my business? It's my business too. I live here and this house is also mine, so I have every damn right to know." In response to this, my dad slapped her and shouted, "Who the hell do you think you are talking back to me like that? It's my money, not yours." His yelling caught my attention, and I ran over to the entrance to the dining room where I saw Dad yelling in her face, "This is my house, my house. I own you. I own these 2 little maggots that I told you to abort years ago. I made it clear that I wanted them gone, but no, you had to have kids, didn't you? We'd have more money if we'd have just gotten rid of those goddamn mistakes." My mum then did something I'd never seen her do. She shoved him back and then yelled, "You know what? I've had it with your threats and your shit. I want a divorce and I want it now. If you hate us so damn bad, well, just leave. You've been nothing but a goddamn piece of shit ever since the kids were born, and I've had enough. And if you ever hurt the kids again, I'll tell the police everything you've ever done to us all these years." What my dad did next still gives me nightmares to this day. He grabbed my mum by the neck, pinned her against the wall, and pulled out a gun from his pocket and pressed it to my mum's head. "You listen to me, and you listen right now. You're not going anywhere unless I say so, and neither are those two little twats. And if you ever, and I mean ever, backtalk me again, or try going to the cops, I swear to God and Satan, I'll take a goddamn chainsaw to your limbs. Then I'll bring my boys over here and have them destroy you and those two little maggots. You got that? My mum was visibly terrified, and so were me and Shannon. Up until now, the worst my dad had ever done was beat us. But now he had totally taken the abuse to a whole new level. When my mum only whimpered in fear, my dad fired a shot between her feet, and then shouted, "I asked you a goddamn question, and I want a goddamn answer right now. Answer me, or I'll kill you and those brats." My mum whimpered in both pain and fear, then nodded. But my dad fired another shot and yelled, "I want a verbal answer, not a nod. When I ask you a question, you answer yes or no. Now answer me properly." My mum stuttered, "Yes." Then I saw my dad snarl, and then he threw my mum down to the floor and spat in her face. He then said, "You better learn your place. This is my house. You have no control unless I say so. Consider yourself and those maggots nothing more than slaves. A bunch of pigs meant to serve me. I'm going out now, and I'd better see my dinner ready by the time I get back, slave. If not, I'll have my boys come down here and absolutely wreck you." He then stormed out of the house and went to God knows where. Probably off to a bar to get drunk. After Dad was gone, we rushed over to confront our mum, who was in tears, and we began crying as well. We had all pretty much been through quite enough with that bastard. And that's when my mum did something she should have done a long time ago. She called the police and told them that we needed them down to our house right now. Once they arrived, all three of us gave the officers our report on what happened. We also told them about how abusive he had been towards us for the past 10 years, and even showed them all the scars on our backs from where he had whipped us with his riding crop. When the two officers saw this, they asked Mum where my dad was now, and she said that she had no idea. Me and Shannon told them that he simply stormed out of the house and left in his truck. We gave them a description of the truck, which was a black 2001 Toyota Tundra, and also gave them the license plate. After about an hour, the police called us and informed my mum that Dad was now in police custody, and he now had additional criminal charges. Apparently, the cops found my dad hanging out behind a strip club with those dirty Mexican friends of his, drinking beer and smoking crystal meth. When they approached him and attempted to put him under arrest for attempted assault with a deadly weapon, he of course resisted and did the most foolish thing anyone could do. Dad threw out his gun and opened fire on the officers, hitting one officer in the leg and the other one in his arm. Then he took off in his truck and fled the scene. His friends took off running into the strip club, where they were later caught and arrested for illegal drug possession. My dad was eventually stopped by the police when they cut him off at a railway crossing, where a long freight train was stopped on the tracks, blocking off the two-line road with their patrol cars. When he attempted to open fire on the cops, an officer tased him with the taser gun and took him into custody. When they searched his truck for any other potential weapons, they found a small unlocked safe underneath the back seats, which contained tons of illegal drugs, ranging from marijuana to crystal meth and LSD. But what they found with the drugs was something that answered the question that Mum had questioned my dad about. It was a list of drugs and how many had been sold. As it turns out, my dad had been working for a Mexican drug cartel for about 4 months. Remember those men Dad was hanging out with? And remember that name, Victor Vasquez? Turns out, Mr. Vasquez was the boss of an extremely dangerous and savage Mexican drug cartel. And those Mexican guys my dad hung out with and invited over to our house were members of the cartel. When the police told us all of this, I remembered that threatening warning my dad had given to his old construction job boss over the phone about killing him if he reported him to the cops. I understood now what must have happened, but the police apparently had already found out and told us everything. Sure enough, my guess was right. The police informed my mum over the phone that when they had contacted his old boss and asked him questions about my dad, they were told that he had fired my dad for hiding drugs in his locker, but he was too afraid to go to the police because he said that Dad was friends with a dangerous Mexican drug cartel boss and was afraid that if he went to the cops, the cartel would come after him and his family and kill them. We were all horrified and disgusted when the police told us all of this, but we were so relieved to hear that he was in custody along with his filthy drug cartel buddies. Me, Mum, and Shannon all appeared in court a few days later and gave our testimonies to the judge, and my dad was found guilty of abuse, physical assault, assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder of a police officer, and drug trafficking, and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison without bail or parole. I'll never forget what my dad said as the cops dragged him away to begin serving his sentence in prison. He yelled, "You better pray. You better pray to God that I never get out, because when I do, you're all dead. All of you are dead." His voice was silenced once the doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind him. I knew that Dad would never get his hands on us, since he'd pretty much be locked up for the rest of his life. He was in his late 50s, and his sentence was 30 to 50 years, meaning he'd either be in his 90s or early hundreds when released. Most likely, he'd be dead before that, so it didn't matter. I never heard about what happened to those other cartel friends of his, but I assumed they ended up getting locked up as well. After that event, our lives got so much better over the next several months. My mum got promoted to being the manager of the CVS pharmacy around October, and also got an increase in salary, and she started dating a 49-year-old retired Navy veteran named George around November. He was the nicest man my mum had ever met, and treated her like a queen. He also loved me and Shannon. The two of them eventually married in December, and George became my stepdad. Me and Shannon even started making a few friends in school. Because of our real father, we'd not been able to socialize very well, due to all the heavy abuse we had to endure from him. But that wasn't a problem anymore. With Dad gone from the house, we were free to do what we wanted without him controlling our lives. I began to pursue a dream that I'd had since I was a kid, and that was becoming a comic book artist. I enrolled in various classes in school, and Shannon planned to one day become a professional photographer, as she loved photography. Life seemed perfect now. But unfortunately, I'm sorry to say the story doesn't end here. 2 years later, on the night before my 18th birthday, April of 2008, which was a Friday, I was awakened at 3 a.m. by a loud clanking sound coming from outside the house next to my bedroom window. I was still half asleep, so I assumed that maybe I imagined it, or just dreamt it. So I booked it, thinking it might have been a raccoon or a possum making the noise, and went back to sleep. In hindsight, I probably should have checked it out or told my mum about it. Otherwise, I might have been able to prevent the horrible events that transpired the next day. You'll soon learn why this is important. My mom and stepdad woke up around 9 a.m. for a special birthday breakfast in the dining room. When I entered the dining room, I was greeted by Shannon, who had served me a large dish of bacon and eggs, sausages, and waffles. Shortly after finishing breakfast, I invited my two new friends named Rex and Layla over to celebrate my birthday. We played our two favorite games, Mario Party and F-Zero GX on our Nintendo GameCube, and watched a few movies as a whole family. Around the afternoon time, we all gathered in the dining room, and my mum brought in my presents and my pink strawberry flavored birthday cake with 18 candles on it. There were 6 presents in total, along with a present I had always wanted. This present was an electric scooter. It had a red bow wrapped around the handlebars. I embraced my mum and thanked her for the present, feeling like the happiest person alive. As my mum prepared to light the candles, we all heard a knock at the front door, which surprised us. We weren't expecting anyone else, so we all wondered who was at the door. I went over to the front door and checked through the peephole, expecting it to maybe be Rex or Layla's parents, but it wasn't them. When I saw who it was, I shit you not, I almost soiled myself. Any joy or excitement that I had was now gone, replaced by blinding terror and fear. Standing right there at the door was my dad, dressed in all black and armed with an assault rifle and hand grenades. He wasn't alone. There were several other guys standing behind him, wearing black jumpsuits and a ski mask. They were all wielding military-grade machine guns and wore belts containing hand grenades. A million questions were rushing through my mind at speeds faster than I could comprehend. How the hell did my dad get out of prison? How were we not notified or warned about it? It didn't really make a difference as to how or why he got out. The fact was that he was out, and he was here to probably kill us. I immediately rushed back into the dining room in full panic mode, and told my mum that we needed to call the police right away. When she asked me why, I told her that Dad was at the front door with several heavily armed men standing behind him. The colour drained from my mum's face when I told her this, and my friends and sister began to panic as well. "No, that's impossible. He's in prison. How could he be here?" Shannon protested. My mum rushed to the door and looked through the peephole. I shit you not, she actually wet herself. She then ran back into the dining room and told George what she saw outside. He immediately feared for our safety and told us we better call the cops right away like I suggested. Just as Mum rushed for the phone to call the police, we all heard rapid banging at the front door, and then we heard my dad shouting at us to open up, or he'd have his men open for us. "Open the door. I know you and those maggots are here. You're gonna pay for locking us up," my dad shouted. George ran into his room and retrieved his revolver with spare ammo clips, as my mum told me and Shannon to hide in the laundry room connected to the kitchen. I knew that my stepdad wouldn't be able to hold these men off, even if he was ex-military. Although he had had military experience and training, he was outnumbered and outweaponed, so there'd be no way of holding off these men if they broke in. Lila and Rex hid in the laundry room with us, and we closed and locked the door as George rushed back into the kitchen with his gun. I couldn't see what was going on out there since the door was closed, but I could hear Mum and George speaking and my dad banging on the front door. "What the hell are you doing? Call the damn cops already," George snapped, as the banging got more aggressive. I heard my mum say in a horrified voice, I can't. The phone's not working." The four of us felt our blood run cold when we heard her say that. Then I heard George say in a now horrified tone, "Shit, they must have cut the phone lines. That's the only thing I can think of. We better use our cell phones instead and hide with the kids." I heard my mum suggest we try running out the back door and escape through the backyard, but George said no. He wasn't sure if there were any armed men out in the backyard, and if there were any, they'd kill us the moment we stepped outside. Mum and George joined us in the small room, and Mum told me to use our cell phones to call 911. My phone was dead, but Shannon's was fully charged, so she tried calling the police. However, real terror started to set in when Shannon reported that her cell phone wasn't getting a signal. She said that her phone was telling her that it was experiencing signal failure and that it couldn't connect to the phone network. Rex and Layla checked their cell phones. They got the same results, and so did Mum and George's cell phone. "No, why aren't they working? They're wireless," Shannon stuttered in horror. George said that those men must have done something to jam the cell phones. It was no coincidence. At this point, all of us began to panic when we realized the magnitude of the situation. My criminal father and presumably the Mexican mafia were outside the door, heavily armed with military-grade weapons, and all the phones were dead. We began to accept the fact that we'd probably die without mercy. There was no way that George could take on 13 men, armed with machine guns and grenades. Even if he was ex-military, he'd be gunned down before he had a chance to fire his own gun. "Mum, what do we do?" I asked fearfully. Mum had no answer, but George spoke up and told us that he'd try and hold off my dad and his goons long enough for us to escape, even if it meant he was killed in the process. My mum absolutely declined and told him that he shouldn't try and dash off like some hero and possibly lose his life. But George told us that he wasn't going to argue and told us to head for the back door the moment he gave the signal. But before George could even open the door, we all heard a deafening explosion that shook the house. George threw open the door and pulled out his gun as we heard footsteps entering. He then opened fire on the masked men and yelled at us to run as the men began firing their machine guns in George's direction. Mum told us to follow her towards the back door, but before we could make it to the dining room, a grenade flew into the kitchen and landed in the sink where it exploded. The force of the explosion threw us all across the room, and I ended up hitting my head on the refrigerator so hard I was knocked out cold. Now, before I continue, I need to warn each and every one of you. This story gets extremely graphic and disturbing from this point on. It traumatizes and disgusts me to just recall or relive the events that transpired next, but I need to get it off my chest and put it behind me once and for all. When I awoke from being unconscious, I found myself tied to a chair and appeared to have been moved to a corner of the kitchen right next to the living room entrance. But that wasn't all I saw. The entire front entranceway of the house along with the door had been blown to pieces, and to my horror, I saw my stepdad laying dead on the floor in a pool of blood, with multiple bullet holes in his back and one through his head. I saw two of the masked men laying on the floor dead with gunshot wounds as well, most likely killed by my stepdad before meeting his end. I turned my head to face the living room and saw something above the now busted TV that nearly made me vomit. My two best friends, Rex and Layla, had been both nailed to the wall by their hands and feet, stripped naked, and had been sliced open from the lower jaw down to their waist. Their eyes had been torn out, along with their internal organs which were spilling over the floor, and their faces bore expressions of pure terror and agony. I then heard screaming coming from the basement, along with what sounded like a gunshot. Then I heard angry yelling coming from downstairs. "Shut up right now, or you'll end up like those two on the wall," a man's voice shouted. It wasn't my dad who was shouting, so I assumed it must have been one of the remaining thugs that survived. I looked around expecting to see another armed thug watching me, but I was alone. This confused me more than ever. I had no idea why they'd leave me alone without someone guarding me to make sure I didn't escape, but it made little difference to me at the time. My hands had been tied with large bungee cords behind a wooden chair, but they weren't tied that tight, so I struggled to try and free myself as quietly as I could without alerting my dad and his men down in the basement. The open basement door was right next to the door leading into the laundry room, and I was only about 5 feet away from it, so I knew I'd better be quiet. If Dad or one of those thugs heard me trying to escape, they'd most likely kill me. Now that I think about it, they were probably going to kill me anyway once they were done doing what they were doing to my mum and Shannon, which was why they left me in the kitchen. They were most likely saving me for last. As I slowly started fiddling with the bonds on my hands, I heard more commotion in the basement. I heard one of the men yell at Shannon, something so disturbing I don't want to think about it. "You better do as he says. My brother doesn't like to be kept waiting, and he's got a very bad temper," another thug warned her coldly. As I got one cord off my hand and started to free my hands from the rest of the bungee cords, I heard my dad say to my mum, "You better swallow every last drop when I blow my load. If you so much as let one drop fall from your mouth, I'll have my men skull that little twat, and then I'll chainsaw the both of you." I didn't have to guess what was going on down there when I heard my dad say that, and I felt my spine shiver when I realized that my mum and Shannon were being abused by those men, which made me even more determined to escape. As I worked more quickly to get out of the remaining restraints, I heard my dad yelling rage. "I rotted in that hellhole prison for 2 years because of you. Those corrupt prison guards beat me, molested me, and tortured me for the fun of it. You sent me to hell, and now you're all going to pay. And I thought I told you. These maggots don't deserve birthdays. It's my house." Suddenly, I heard my mum yell in retaliation, and then I heard my dad yell as well. I panicked and began to work faster as I heard one of the men yell, "Who told you to stop?" My dad then said, "You just signed your death warrants. As soon as I'm done with you two, the other one upstairs is coming with us, and he'll serve as our boss's replacement sissy boy." I then heard Shannon begging for mercy, then the sound of her being struck with something. I started sweating and cursing softly under my breath as I desperately fumbled through the last of the bungee cords, feeling tears run down my face as I heard my dad yelling more obscenities at my mum and Shannon. Just as I freed myself from my restraints, I heard my dad order his men to restrain my mum and Shannon. Then I heard them start begging for their lives. I slowly stood up from the chair and looked over to the dead thug on the floor near the entrance, and noticed that their weapons and grenade belts were still lying on the floor next to them. Then I looked over at the basement door. I quietly crept over to the destroyed entryway of the house and picked up one of the machine guns for defense. Then I looked down at one of the grenades and weighed my options. I could try chucking a grenade into the basement and blowing those guys to pieces, but I knew that wouldn't be a wise choice. If I used a grenade, I'd blow up my whole basement and probably end up killing my mum and Shannon in the process. The only way of taking out those men would be to use the machine gun, but that was also a bad idea. The basement was small, and if I started shooting down there, I might end up hitting my mum or Shannon. I was outnumbered, and outgunned, so I didn't stand a chance. The only option would be to run, but I didn't really want to leave my mother and Shannon behind with those monsters. However, I knew that I didn't have much of a choice, so I made the decision to escape through the back door while avoiding any possible thugs that might be outside guarding the area. Then, to get as far away as possible safely to a neighbor's house and call the police. As I took one of the grenade belts containing 5 grenades, along with 2 spare ammo clips strapped around my waist, I heard the most horrible sound imaginable. I heard the sound of a chainsaw being revved up, along with my mum's screams of agony and Shannon's wails of horror. Over the roar of the chainsaw engine, I heard my dad yell in both rage and sadistic delight, "No one's coming to save you. You're going to die." I knew what was happening, and I felt so helpless, knowing that I could do nothing but to run. As I ran through the living room and into the dining room to get to the back door, my heart dropped at the sight I was greeted with. The dining room table had been knocked over, my birthday cake splattered on the floor, and all of my presents had been smashed and destroyed, including my new scooter. It was broken into several pieces. Wires could be seen protruding from the monitor, and there was also a message on the wall in Rex and Layla's blood. "Mistakes don't deserve birthdays." I couldn't believe what I was seeing, nor could I believe what was going on. One moment I'm the happiest person in the world with a loving family and having the best birthday ever. The next, these armed murderers led by my evil father ruined it, breaking in and murdering my stepfather and 2 best friends. And now my sister and mother are most likely being murdered as well. And I couldn't do anything about it. All I could do was run, and run I did. I slowly opened the door leading into the backyard, holding the machine gun tightly in my hands and checking my surroundings. The sun was starting to set as I slowly made my way across the small yard and over towards the wooden fence near the end which led to my neighbor's. From there, I'd cross through her yard and try to call the cops from her home once I explained the situation. The thought made me wonder if anyone had called the cops at some point since my house was invaded. Surely someone must have heard the explosions and gunshots and called the police by now. So why hadn't they shown up? My thoughts were interrupted when I heard a man shout, "Who the hell are you?" I turned my head and saw 2 masked thugs standing near the shed next to the house with machine guns in their hands. I didn't hesitate and immediately opened fire on the 2 thugs with my machine gun before they could fully raise their own weapons, hitting them both in the chest and face. As soon as I was done with them, I quickly started running towards the fence, knowing that my dad and his other men probably heard the gunshots and would come running outside to investigate. As I started climbing the fence, I dropped the machine gun into the other yard, just as I heard my dad yell, "Hey, what's going on over there?" I scrambled like mad on the other side of the fence and managed to make it into Mrs. Westwood's yard, as I heard my dad order one of his men to go and see what all the commotion was about. Once I got back on my feet, I retrieved the machine gun and took running across the yard, but I hid behind a large doghouse as I saw the fence wiggling. As I stayed hidden, I saw one of my dad's masked henchmen poke his head out of the top of the fence and scan the area. Once he was convinced I wasn't there, he returned to my yard, and I heard him run back towards my house, shouting something to my dad. I then heard my dad yell from all the way in the house, "That little maggot escaped and killed 2 of our men. You fool! Get your asses out and find the damn rat. If he gets far away enough, he'll have the damn cops down here in minutes. I don't care what you use or do, but find him. I want him alive." I decided at this point, going to Mrs. Westwood for help wouldn't be a wise choice. If Dad and his goons decided to come onto her property to search for me, I'd be putting her in terrible danger, which was the last thing I wanted. So I decided to head further away from my house and find a safe place to call the police. I was pretty sure Mum and Shannon were dead at this point, and this thought brought a tear to my eye. All my life, I had been treated like garbage by my abusive father, and my mother and Shannon were the only two people I had at the time to keep me going. They were always there to look out for me, to care for me, and now I would probably never see them again. I really wished that my dad had been a different person and not some heartless, drunk, abusive bastard who beat his own children for sport because he hated them. Fathers are supposed to love and care for their children, not treat them like they shouldn't have been allowed to exist. I hated my father for all the hell he put me and my family through, and I wanted to make him pay. I thought about it long and hard. Then I decided to do what needed to be done. I was going to try and take out the last 3 thugs in my house along with my dad. I knew it was suicide, but I didn't care anymore. I had just lost everything and everyone I cared about to my dad, so I had nothing to lose except my life. If I was going to die, I was going to take the bastards who killed my family down with me. I headed out the back gate that led into the front yard of Mrs. Westwood's house. Then I made my way across the yard and into the sidewalk, where I then slowly made my way back towards my house. As my house came into view and I got close enough, I noticed something near the driveway that I failed to notice earlier. There was a white van with no license plates parked behind my mum's Honda Civic, with its side door open, and in there were none other than the remaining 3 masked men. But my father wasn't there. The men were fiddling with something in the van and had their backs turned to me, so they didn't notice or hear me when I slowly crept towards them. A sadistic grin came over my face as I realized I had the element of surprise on my side. "Time to pay, assholes," I said softly, reaching down to my waist. I pulled a hand grenade off my belt, yanked the pin out, and then threw the grenade right into the van, where it landed right under the feet of one of the 3 thugs. The moment they looked down to see what landed in the van, the grenade detonated as the entire van exploded into pieces, killing the last of the henchmen and destroying my mum's car in the process too. As soon as the van was destroyed, I turned towards my house, just as I heard my dad yelling from inside. As soon as he stepped out, I felt my blood boil when I saw him. This was the man that caused me so much pain and suffering since I was a child, and now I was going to make him pay for what he had done. As soon as I raised my gun at him, he turned around and looked directly at me, and then I yelled, "Go to hell, you demon." I fired the gun, and several shots rang out, hitting my dad in both his legs, left kneecap, and his right shoulder. He fell to the ground screaming and cursing in pain as I prepared to end him with a shot to the head. But I stopped short when I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and there were lots of them. I felt a rush of relief as I realized that the police were coming. So I threw the machine aside and removed the grenade belt from my waist, as not to make the cops think I was the bad guy. Just before I could move, I heard my dad shout, "You piece of shit. I swear you'll pay for this. I should have just killed you and your stupid sister the moment you left your mum." I responded by spitting in his face. I then ran across the yard, leaving my dad and the weapons behind, as I attempted to get as far away from the house as I could, just in case my dad decided to try shooting at me. He may not have been able to stand since I shot his leg really well, but he would still be able to move his arm and hands, and that meant he'd be able to shoot me or try to bomb me with a grenade. Once I got past 4 houses just down the street, the adrenaline in my system began wearing off, and I collapsed into the front lawn of a neighbor's house next to the driveway, completely exhausted from being in fight or flight mode. As I lay there, and began accepting the reality of everything that had just taken place, I just broke down sobbing. Then I began to feel myself slipping into unconsciousness from exhaustion. Through my tears, I saw dozens of flashing red and blue lights heading in my direction. There were 5 police cars, 3 unmarked police cars, and a heavily armored SWAT truck heading in the direction of my house. One of the unmarked patrol cars seemed to have noticed me, because one of them slowed down and drove up to me on the driveway just a few feet away from me. That was the last thing I saw before blacking out. When I woke up, I found myself laying in a hospital bed, with 3 police officers and an FBI detective standing next to me. The detective introduced himself as Detective Fox Riley, and told me that he was the one in the unmarked police car who noticed me lying on the ground and had called for an ambulance to bring me to the hospital. Now, as you can guess, I had a lot of questions, but the first thing I asked was where my mum and sister were. Were they all right? The detective looked down with a sad face and said, "I'm very sorry, Todd, but I have some bad news regarding that question." Detective Riley hesitated for a moment, then with a heavy sigh, told me that my sister and mother were both dead. My heart nearly stopped when I heard him say that. I had already suspected that Dad had killed them, but I wasn't able to confirm it at the time when I was still at my house, since I'd been running and fighting for my life. However, I didn't want to accept what I had just been told. I asked for proof, and Detective Riley told me he had evidence photos he took at the crime scene, but he warned me they were very graphic and disturbing, and advised me to reconsider my request, but I insisted on seeing them. Detective Riley pulled some photos out of a briefcase and handed them to me, and what I saw on those photos nearly made me vomit. I had already suspected that I was going to see some very nasty stuff, but nothing up until this point could have prepared me for what I saw. The first photo was of my mother, laying on the basement floor with all 4 of her limbs cut off, right at the hips and shoulders. Her eyes had been gouged out, her gut had been sliced open, and all of her internal organs had been torn out and sprawled across the floor right next to her corpse. Shannon fared no better. She also had all her limbs sawn off, and her insides had been ripped out. But unlike Mum, her entire face had been shaven off, and her eyeballs removed as well. She'd had her sex organs also cut off, along with my mum's too, and from what I could tell from looking a little closer, I saw what looked like semen, splurted all over the eye sockets of both my mother and Shannon. This was more than I could take, and ended up vomiting all over the side of the bed. Then I just broke down sobbing again. That bastard father of mine had murdered my friends and my entire family, and I was now alone. A nurse was called in to clean up the mess that I made from puking. Then through my tears I asked the officers where my father was, and Detective Riley told me that he had been taken to hospital to be treated for his injuries, and that he was arrested. I asked him why he had gotten out of prison to begin with, and Detective Riley told me everything he'd found out from his investigation. My dad had broken out of prison during a power outage a week ago that had been supposedly caused by bad weather, but was later discovered to have been caused by an act of sabotage done to the power lines, caused by none other than the Mexican cartel group run by the mafia boss, Marco Vasquez, the brother of Victor Vasquez, who my father worked for before his imprisonment 2 years ago. The saboteurs were 2 Mexican drug cartel thugs disguised as linesmen who had stolen an electrical line truck, then drove down to the prison where they destroyed the main electrical generator to the prison where my dad was being held, effectively knocking out the power to the whole prison. They also damaged the backup generator so that there would be no backup power, which meant all the security systems would be down, along with the electronic locks on the cell doors of the prison, allowing my dad and dozens of other prisoners to escape their cells. Once they got out of their cells, my dad and his 5 drug cartel inmate friends overpowered the 3 guards by slicing their throats with kitchen knives, took their guns, and several other officers as well. Once they left, they fled the prison on foot for about 2 miles and were then spotted by several witnesses entering a black van with completely tinted windows. The police tried to stop them, but my dad and his men easily overpowered the pursuing cop cars with RPG launchers and a Gatling gun inside the van. They then disappeared inside an abandoned tunnel and managed to evade the police entirely. When the police finally found the van, it was completely empty and had been stripped of all possible evidence. After that, they had gone completely off the grid until last night, where several people in my neighborhood noticed a white van with no license plates driving around 2 a.m. and stopping at various houses. The witnesses also mentioned seeing several men in ski masks coming out of the van and wander into the yards of several houses in each block, but they were already gone by the time the police got there to check things out. Yet one of the witnesses did mention seeing someone who looked like my dad getting into the driver's side of the van. That is what got Detective Riley's attention and convinced him to warn my family the next day to get out of the house and into police protective custody, as he was certain that my dad and his men were coming for us. However, he couldn't reach us on our home phones or cell phones. He was convinced that my dad and his men had gotten to us and came down with a team to try and stop them. Now everything made sense. Remember earlier when I mentioned that I thought I heard something making noise outside my house late last night? Well, I soon learned what it was when Detective Riley told me what they found when the police searched my house for evidence inside and out. Turns out the phone box I'd set up my house had been smashed open, and all the wires connecting to the phone lines had been ripped out. The police also found an illegal cell phone signal jamming device attached to the wires connected to our Wi-Fi network, which jammed all cell phone signals within a 30-foot radius. But our house wasn't the only one that had been hit. After thorough investigation of the neighborhood by police and FBI officials, they found that every single house on our block, and the houses 1 block over, had also been hit and had their phone lines cut. They were convinced that my dad and his men had done this last night, so none of the neighbors would be able to call for help once they noticed the commotion in my house. So that was it. That's what I heard last night when I woke up. It wasn't a wild animal that I had heard outside my room. It had been my dad or one of his men smashing our phone box open and cutting our phone line and jamming our cell phone signals. I couldn't believe how clueless I had been. If I had actually bothered to wake up my mum and tell her about what I'd heard, her death might have been prevented, and so would the deaths of my sister, stepfather, and 2 best friends. But Detective Riley told me that it wasn't my fault, and that there's no way I could have known. He suspected that Victor Vasquez had been planning this for the past 2 years, since he and my dad got locked up in prison, most likely for revenge. Due to how well calculated this whole plan had been, Detective Riley was pretty sure that he had help from other members of his brother's drug cartel, and possibly even corrupt cops and prison guards both inside and out, and there was no way that Victor and my dad could have pulled this off without help from Marco's drug cartel. As of now, they had no clue as to where Victor and his brother were, but Detective Riley assured me that they'd soon find the answers to their location once he questioned my dad. Once Detective Riley finished telling me this, I couldn't even begin to describe the pain I felt from everything that had just happened to me. All my hopes and dreams, all my plans for the future had been forever shattered and changed because of what my dad had just done, and on my birthday. I don't know what to do now. There was no way I could go back to my house now, not after everything that had just happened. Detective Riley told me that he was very, very sorry for my loss, and that he would do all he could to help me for now, and he even told me happy birthday. But I didn't even acknowledge it. How could I? My first and only true birthday had been ruined, in the most nightmarish way imaginable. There's no way I'd ever be happy on my birthday again, not after this. The day of my birthday would always serve as a reminder of the day that my entire family was murdered by that bastard father of mine. Detective Riley then told me that he wanted me to answer some questions that he had, and took out a voice recorder from his briefcase. This included everything that had happened from the moment I woke up on the morning of my birthday, to everything that had happened after my dad arrived at my house to completely ruin my life forever. I really didn't want to relive those moments, as they haunted me. But Detective Riley said it was very important, because I'd be providing a lot of extra evidence for the upcoming trial that my dad would be facing in court, once he was well enough recovered to move around again. So, without much hesitation, I told Detective Riley everything that had happened on the day of my birthday, from the moment I woke up to the moment where I blacked out on the neighbor's driveway. It took about an hour to explain everything from start to finish, and once I finally got to the part where I passed out on the driveway, I was breaking down in tears again. Detective Riley thanked me for my interview, and told me that it would be everything that he needed to further build his case against my dad. He also commended me on how brave I was for taking on all those armed thugs, outnumbered and outgunned, and that not many people would be willing to do something like that. I asked him if he really believed everything I had told him, and he nodded. Detective Riley told me that the forensics team had found enough DNA evidence in my house to prove that my story was true, such as my fingerprints that had been found all over the bungee cords that had been used to restrain me, and on the machine gun and grenade belt that I had left behind, so I wouldn't have to worry about being doubted by the authorities. Later on, I was told by Detective Riley that he had arranged for me to stay at a nearby hotel after I was checked out of the hospital, as they saw no reason to keep me there since I had no serious injuries. They would also have the place kept under heavy police protection in case the cartel decided to send more thugs after me. Once I was at the hotel, I did absolutely nothing but to reflect on the tragedy that had befallen my birthday, and I hardly got any sleep at all. About a week later on a Tuesday, I was brought over to the courthouse by an unmarked police car to participate in the trial against my dad that afternoon, and to testify against him if called upon by the judge. Once I arrived at the courthouse, I entered the courtroom, and I saw my dad in a wheelchair at the defendant's booth, with whom I presumed was his lawyer sitting next to him. My eyes burnt with fire as I stared at him. I was so tempted to just run up and strangle him for taking my family from me, but I knew that would be pointless. Killing him out of hatred wouldn't bring my family back, and I'd only be getting in trouble with the law for doing so. So I took my seat in the witness booth and tried to calm down. There were lots of witnesses in the booths, including the parents of Rex and Layla, who had no doubt shown up to testify against my dad for the murder of their children. During the trial, the prosecutor revealed all the evidence that the police and FBI had found at my house, along with my recorded interview with Detective Riley, to the judge, including one more piece of evidence that horrified me. It was a snuff film that my dad and his men had made of my mum and Shannon. The jury all viewed the film after the judge excused the witnesses from the courtroom, so thankfully I was spared from whatever horrors they had to see. Even with the doors to the courtroom closed, they were thin enough to where I could hear almost everything going on from inside there. I heard the sounds of Mum and Shannon screaming in pain and being absolutely destroyed, the sounds of my dad and his men ordering to shut them up, and then the horrible sounds of the chainsaw used to butcher them. I heard many other things on the film in the courtroom that were so horrible I don't want to describe them here. But what I will say is that my dad and his men had apparently committed the act of necrophilia, since I heard the judge question him about it later on. The rest of the trial is unimportant, so I'll skip to the end. Once everyone was called back into the courtroom, I saw several members of the jury looking completely sickened by what they had just seen, including the judge, who was slightly green in the face. After the jury looked over at the evidence and gave their conclusion to the judge, my dad was found guilty of first-degree murder of multiple police officers, the torture, rape, and murder of my mother's sister, 2 best friends, and was given the death penalty. 2 weeks later, I went over to the penitentiary where my dad's execution would be taking place, and I met up with the family members of my 2 best friends. They told me that they were sorry for what had happened to me, and they'd do anything they could to help me if I needed it. At approximately 11:55 a.m., me and dozens of other witnesses gathered in the witness room, where the execution of my father would soon take place. Once the clock struck 12, the curtains to the execution room slid open to reveal my father in an orange prison suit and strapped to the lethal injection table with 2 needles in his arms. The table had been raised up in a position to where my dad faced directly to me, and he just glared coldly at me with hatred in his eyes, but I did the same as well. This man had just taken everything from me, and now he'd finally got what was coming to him. I'll never forget what he said when the warden told him to make his final statement before the executioner activated the lethal injection machine to start the injection. Dad sneered while looking at me and said, "I hope the devil and his demons are doing your sweet little family members up the arse, 'cause when I get to hell, the devil and me are gonna do them up the arse for eternity. And I'll do the same to your friends. Have a crappy life, alone, like the trash you are. See you in hell." He started cackling like the Joker himself, as the table was lowered back down, but he went silent as the warden then told the executioner to proceed with the execution. He flipped a switch on the lethal injection machine, and my dad was soon sedated, as the machine injected a sedative into his system. After the 2 drugs were injected into his system, he died successfully, and we were all left in the building knowing that justice had been done, and my dad was now burning in hell for all eternity for the sins he had committed. But I was never the same person again after that. Because of what I'd been through on my 18th birthday, I ended up falling into a deep state of depression and developed a bad case of PTSD. My mother's life insurance policy left me with enough money to make a decent living, but I could never return to my old house after everything that had happened. I sold the old house and moved far away to Oregon and rented an apartment to live in, hoping to try and put the past behind me. But I still haven't gotten over it, even to this day. Therapy, counseling, and even antidepressants have done nothing to ease the horrible depression and traumatizing nightmares that I continuously deal with every day. I never pursued my dream of becoming a comic book artist either, as it now seemed pointless. Instead, I dropped out of school and just started working at a fast food restaurant, making $9.50 an hour, just to continue living. And it hasn't gotten any better. I've often thought about just ending it all, since my life just seems pointless now. I have no other friends or relatives, and I've shut myself out from any social activity outside of work. I've also become an alcoholic and drug addict, just to try and ease from the constant pain I go through each day, knowing I'll never be happy again. And all because of my father. I'm writing this story now because I wanted to get it out there before ending my pain, so I can finally be with my mother and sister in heaven. I've already prepared the shotgun for myself, and I'm about to end my misery. But before I end it all, I have a few things to say for all of those who hear this. If you have a family member that's abusing you, be it your mother, father, or siblings, tell someone about it. Don't put it off like my mum constantly did, or things will get worse like it did for me. Stand up for yourself if you're being abused, and don't stand by and let it escalate. And to my father, I have something to say for you as well. I hope we never meet again in the afterlife, and may your soul forever burn in the deepest, darkest pits of hell for all eternity. And that's all I have to say. Mum, George, Shannon, Rex, Layla, I'm coming home. You won't be alone anymore, and neither will I. I'm coming home, and we'll all be a big, happy family again. Goodbye, everyone. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this extra long bonanza episode. It really was quite fun to narrate. So if you made it this far, you probably listened to the fourth story. Wow, brutal, really good. And thank you to the writer who sent that to me. Really good stories tonight. Also thank you to Wolf's Campfire for joining me with his narration. It really was fun to have him on. If you enjoyed his narration, he produces lots of creepy content too. And you'll find a link at the end shortly on screen and in the description to give you a chance to see some of his works when you're done here. Don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts, as it does go a long way. Something else you can do is subscribe and press the bell icon to be notified every time I post. But for now, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.